Don't move. Stay right there. Hands flat. You hear me? Oh.
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ridgewood Avenue as the dark blue sedan moved through the tree-lined streets of the Belmont Heights neighborhood. It was a Thursday, just past 3:15 in the afternoon, and the quiet suburb on the outskirts of Milwaukee, Wisconsin seemed frozen in that peaceful lull between the end of the workday and the return of commuters. Sprinklers hissed on manicured lawns. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Children's laughter echoed from a backyard pool 3 streets over. Nothing about this moment suggested that it would soon become one of the most consequential traffic stops in the state's recent history. Behind the wheel of that sedan sat Deputy U.S. Marshal Derek Patterson, a man who had dedicated 17 years of his life to federal law enforcement. His hands rested easily on the steering wheel as he navigated the unfamiliar streets, following the GPS directions that would take him back to the highway. He had just finished a preliminary site assessment for a potential witness relocation, the kind of routine task that rarely made it into reports, but formed the backbone of Marshal Service operations. The temporary Wisconsin plates on his rental vehicle caught the afternoon light as he signaled for a right turn onto Maplecrest Drive. What Derek did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that he had attracted attention the moment he entered this neighborhood. 2 blocks behind him, a patrol car had pulled away from a convenience store parking lot and begun following at a careful distance. The officer behind the wheel was watching, waiting, looking for something that would justify what he had already decided to do. Officer Raymond Novak had spent 9 years with the Milwaukee County Police Department. In that time, he had accumulated 14 citizen complaints, a number that should have triggered serious intervention long before this Thursday afternoon. Most of those complaints shared disturbing similarities. They involved traffic stops. They involved black drivers. They involved questions that had nothing to do with traffic violations and everything to do with assumptions about who belonged where. Novak's supervisors had documented some concerns over the years. There had been a mandatory sensitivity training session after complaint number 7, a verbal counseling after complaint number 11, but nothing that actually changed his behavior, nothing that stopped him from doing exactly what he was about to do again. For 7 blocks, Novak followed the blue sedan. His dashboard camera captured every moment of that pursuit, though he would later claim he was simply patrolling his assigned area. The sedan maintained a perfect speed, staying precisely at the posted 30-mile-per-hour limit. The driver used turn signals at every intersection. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that constituted a traffic violation. But Novak kept following anyway, his patience wearing thin as he searched for an excuse. Then he found one, or rather, he invented one. As the sedan made a gentle right turn onto Birchwood Lane, the passenger side tires came within inches of the white fog line marking the edge of the lane. They may have touched it. They may not have. The dashboard camera footage would later prove inconclusive, but for Novak, it was enough. The lights came on. The siren gave a single sharp whoop, and a chain of events began that would destroy careers, trigger federal investigations, and expose a rot at the heart of a police department that had been allowed to fester for far too long. If you are new to this channel, I want you to know that we tell stories that matter. Stories about justice, accountability, and the systems that are supposed to protect all of us. If that resonates with you, consider subscribing. Your support helps us continue bringing these important cases to light. Derek saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror and felt his stomach tighten. It was not fear exactly. He had faced armed fugitives, kicked in doors where anything could be waiting on the other side, and testified in courtrooms where dangerous men stared at him with murder in their eyes. This was different. This was the particular tension that every black man in America knows intimately, that moment of vulnerability when you are at the mercy of someone who has already made assumptions about who you are and what you are capable of. He pulled over smoothly, bringing the sedan to a stop along the curb in front of a well-maintained colonial home with a children's swing set visible in the backyard. He put the car in park. He turned off the engine, and then, with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly how critical the next few minutes could be, he placed both hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position, fingers spread wide where they could be clearly seen. Through the side mirror, he watched the officer exit the patrol car. The body language was wrong. Derek had been in law enforcement long enough to read the subtle signals that most civilians never noticed. The way the officer's hand immediately went to rest on his holstered weapon, the aggressive forward lean of his approach, the speed of his steps too fast, too purposeful for a routine traffic stop. Everything about this approach screamed hostility, and the stop had not even officially begun. Novak reached the driver's window and stood slightly behind it, positioning himself in that tactical stance officers are taught to use when they anticipate potential threats. His body camera was recording, capturing everything in crisp, high definition, though in the moment, this fact seemed to be the furthest thing from his mind. The footage would later serve as the primary evidence of his own misconduct, a perfect documentation of professional suicide. Derek lowered his window slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and controlled. His hands returned to the steering wheel the moment the window was down. He looked up at the officer with the calm, measured expression of a professional who knew exactly how to handle confrontational situations. But he also recognized with a sinking certainty that being calm and professional might not be enough today. The first words out of Novak's mouth confirmed every suspicion Derek had. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? Not license and registration, please. Not do you know why I stopped you?" The question was an accusation disguised as an inquiry, and the implication behind it was as clear as the afternoon sun reflecting off the patrol car's hood. "You do not belong here. You are suspicious simply by existing in this space. Explain yourself." Derek took a slow breath, forcing his voice to remain even and professional despite the anger beginning to simmer beneath his composure. "Officer, I'm a federal agent, Deputy U.S. Marshal. My credentials are in my jacket pocket on the passenger seat. May I reach for them to show you?" It was the correct response. The protocol, perfect response. A clear identification of who he was and where his identification could be found, followed by a request for permission before making any movements. 17 years of training and experience distilled into 3 sentences designed to de-escalate and clarify. Novak's response made everything worse. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything. Step out of the vehicle now." The words came rapid-fire, clipped, and aggressive, leaving no room for discussion or clarification. Derek felt his jaw tighten. This was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. Federal agents have specific legal protections during interactions with local law enforcement. They have the right to identify themselves safely. These were protocols that every officer was supposed to know and follow. "Sir, I'm a federal law enforcement officer," Derek repeated, his voice still calm but firm. "I am asking permission to show you my credentials so we can resolve this quickly and professionally." I said step out of the vehicle. Novak's hand tightened on his weapon, not drawing it, not yet, but making the threat implicit. The message was clear: comply or face escalation. Derek understood in that moment that he had a choice to make. He could insist on his rights and risk this situation spiraling further out of control, or he could comply with the unlawful orders and trust that the truth would eventually prevail. He chose compliance, not because he was afraid, though only a fool would not feel fear in such a moment, not because he believed Novak was in the right. He chose compliance because he was a professional, because he knew that resistance would only give Novak ammunition for whatever false narrative he was already constructing, and because the cameras, his presence of mind to remember the cameras, meant that the truth was being documented whether Novak realized it or not. Derek opened the door slowly, keeping his hands visible at all times. He stepped out of the vehicle with the deliberate movements of someone who understood that any sudden motion could be misinterpreted, willfully or otherwise. He stood beside the car, hands raised slightly from his sides, palms open and facing forward, and looked directly at the officer who was treating him like a criminal for the crime of driving while black. "Turn around, hands on the vehicle." Derek complied, turning to face the sedan and placing his palms flat against the warm metal of the roof. The position was humiliating by design, forcing him to submit to authority, to demonstrate physical vulnerability. Behind him, he could hear Novak breathing, could sense the officer's proximity, could feel the wrongness of this entire situation pressing against him like a physical weight. "I'm going to tell you again, officer. My name is Derek Patterson. I am a Deputy United States Marshal, badge number 74291. My credentials are in the inside pocket of my jacket, which is lying on the passenger seat. If you will let me retrieve them, or if you retrieve them yourself, we can clear this up immediately." Novak did not respond to the information. Instead, he patted Derek down roughly, hands moving across his body with more force than necessary. When he felt the service weapon holstered at Derek's hip, he stepped back sharply. "You've got a gun." "Yes, I told you I'm a federal agent. I am armed in the course of my official duties." Anyone can say they're a federal agent. Derek closed his eyes for just a moment, drawing on every reserve of patience he had developed over nearly 2 decades of handling difficult people in difficult situations. "That is exactly why I have been asking you to let me show you my credentials. They are right there in the vehicle. My badge and ID card are in my jacket. Please, either let me retrieve them or retrieve them yourself." "Don't tell me how to do my job." The response was defensive, hostile, the reaction of someone who knew they had made mistakes and was now doubling down rather than admitting error. Novak had followed this man for 7 blocks without cause. He had initiated a stop based on an imaginary, or at best, trivially minor violation. He had refused to allow identification. And now, with each passing moment, he was digging himself deeper into a hole from which there would be no escape. Across the street, a woman named Carmen Rodriguez had been unloading groceries from her minivan when she heard the raised voices. What she saw when she turned around made her stop mid-motion, a bag of apples forgotten in her hands. The scene before her was troubling in ways she could not quite articulate. The officer's posture was aggressive, confrontational. The man at the car, hands pressed against the roof, was clearly cooperating fully, yet the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. Carmen set down the groceries and reached for her phone. She was not the type to record police interactions normally. She had always believed that officers deserved the benefit of the doubt, that most of them were good people doing a difficult job. But something about this scene triggered an instinct she could not ignore. The contrast between the man's calm compliance and the officer's aggressive behavior was too stark, too troubling. Her thumb found the camera app and she began to record. That decision, made in a moment of instinct and concern, would later prove to be one of the most important factors in ensuring justice. Carmen's footage would capture angles that the body camera missed. It would show the full context of the interaction from a perspective that could not be dismissed as biased or incomplete. It would become evidence that corroborated everything Derek Patterson would later claim and contradicted everything Raymond Novak would try to deny. Novak finally seemed to realize he needed backup. He keyed his radio and called dispatch, and the words that came out of his mouth would later be played in courtrooms and on news broadcasts as evidence of his deliberate deception. "Dispatch, this is Unit 417. I've got a suspicious individual on Birchwood Lane, near the 1400 block. He's claiming to be a federal agent, but is being uncooperative and possibly armed. Requesting backup." Derek heard every word, and for the first time since the stop began, he felt genuine anger cutting through his professional composure. Uncooperative. He had done nothing but cooperate. He had identified himself. He had offered to show credentials. He had complied with every unlawful order Novak had given him. And now this officer was lying to dispatch, creating a false narrative that could follow Derek for the rest of his career, or worse, could justify escalation if responding officers arrived expecting to encounter a dangerous suspect rather than a compliant federal agent. "That is not true, and you know it," Derek said, his voice tight but controlled. "I have cooperated with everything you've asked. Your own body camera will show that." Novak ignored him. The backup call had been made. The false report was now part of the official record, and 2 more officers were on their way, prepared for a confrontation that existed only in Novak's fabricated version of events. Tell me what you think in the comments. Should officers face automatic termination for filing false reports during traffic stops? Your perspective matters in these conversations. The backup units arrived within 4 minutes. 2 patrol cars pulled up, one from each direction, their lights adding to the spectacle that was now drawing attention from every house on the block. More windows opened, more faces appeared. 3 more phones came out to record. What had started as a wrongful stop was becoming a neighborhood event, documented from half a dozen angles by citizens who sensed that something deeply wrong was unfolding before their eyes. The first officer to exit the backup vehicles was a woman named Patricia Brennan, a 12-year veteran who had seen more than her share of problematic stops during her career. Her partner, a younger officer named Marcus Webb, followed close behind, his hand hovering near his weapon in response to the suspicious individual call that had brought them here. Brennan took in the scene with practiced eyes. The detained man, hands still on the vehicle, calm and still. Novak, agitated and aggressive, standing too close. The gathering crowd of witnesses, many with phones raised. The whole picture felt wrong to her immediately, but years of experience had taught her to gather information before making judgments. "What's the situation?" she asked Novak. "Guy claims to be a federal agent. Won't cooperate. Won't show ID." Derek turned his head slightly, addressing Brennan directly while keeping his hands visible. "That is not accurate, officer. I have repeatedly asked permission to retrieve my credentials from the vehicle. Your colleague has refused to allow it. My name is Derek Patterson, Deputy United States Marshal, badge number 74291. My identification is in my jacket pocket on the passenger seat. I am fully cooperative and have been since this stop began." The contrast between Derek's measured professionalism and Novak's aggressive hostility was immediately apparent to Brennan. She had seen this pattern before, though usually not with such an articulate and clearly trained subject. Something about the man's bearing, his precise language, his careful movements, everything about him suggested law enforcement training. She turned to Novak. "Did you let him show his ID?" Novak bristled at the question. "He's being evasive. I'm handling this." "He just gave us his badge number," Brennan pointed out. "That's pretty specific for someone being evasive. I'm the primary on this stop. Are you going to back me up or not?" Brennan and Webb exchanged a look. In that brief moment of eye contact, an entire conversation took place. They both recognized the warning signs. They both understood that Novak had created a situation that was spiraling toward disaster, and they both knew that their own careers could be damaged by association if they did not handle this correctly. Webb was newer, less confident, but he trusted Brennan's instincts. When she gave an almost imperceptible nod, he understood. She was going to try to salvage this situation, and he needed to follow her lead rather than Novak's. Brennan stepped closer to Derek, her approach notably less aggressive than Novak's had been. "Sir, I'm Officer Brennan. If you have credentials that can verify your identity, I'd like to see them. Can you tell me exactly where they are?" "Inside the vehicle. Passenger seat. There's a gray sports jacket. My badge and ID card are in the inside breast pocket. I also have a valid carry permit, and my service weapon is holstered on my right hip, which your colleague has already discovered." Brennan nodded. "I'm going to retrieve those credentials. Please remain where you are." "Thank you, officer." Novak stepped forward, blocking Brennan's path to the vehicle. "I haven't authorized a search. This is my stop." "You called us for backup. The man has been asking to show his ID since this started. Let's just verify who he is and move on." "I make that call, not you." The standoff lasted several seconds, Novak and Brennan staring at each other while Derek remained motionless against the vehicle, and the neighborhood watched in growing concern. This was the moment where the situation could have de-escalated. If Novak had simply stepped aside, if he had allowed the verification that should have happened 10 minutes earlier, the damage might have been contained. His career might have survived. Instead, he made the choice that would end everything. "I'm searching this vehicle," Novak announced. "We've got an armed suspect claiming to be a federal agent. That gives me probable cause." Derek straightened slightly, still keeping his hands visible but no longer pressed against the car. "I do not consent to any search of this vehicle. I am a federal officer, and this car may contain sensitive materials related to ongoing federal investigations. A warrantless search without probable cause is a violation of the Fourth Amendment and potentially a federal crime." Novak ignored him completely. He moved to the passenger door, opened it, and began rifling through the contents of the vehicle. Derek watched in helpless frustration as 9 years of unchecked behavior reached its catastrophic conclusion. Brennan watched with growing horror as her colleague committed what she recognized as career suicide. The crowd watched and recorded as the search proceeded, phones capturing every illegal moment for posterity. It took Novak less than 30 seconds to find the jacket Derek had described. He pulled it from the passenger seat, reached into the inside pocket, and withdrew a leather credential case. Inside was a gold badge and a Department of Justice identification card. Deputy United States Marshal Derek Patterson. The photograph on the card matched the man standing 10 feet away, with his hands raised in compliant surrender. Novak stared at the credentials for a long moment. The body camera captured his face, and later viewers would debate what emotions flickered across his features. Surprise, certainly. Fear, probably. Anger at being proven wrong, definitely. But not remorse. not the immediate recognition that he had made a terrible mistake. If anything, his expression hardened, as though the proof of Derek's identity was somehow an affront rather than a correction. "These could be fake," he said finally. "Anyone can buy a fake badge online." Brennan had seen enough. She stepped forward, took the credentials from Novak's hand, and examined them herself. The badge was genuine. The ID card had all the security features she had been trained to recognize. Everything about these credentials was authentic, and she knew it, and somewhere in his mind, Novak knew it too. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 231. We need verification on a federal badge. Deputy Marshal, badge number 74291. Name on the ID is Derek Patterson." The response came back in less than 40 seconds. "Unit 231, be advised. Badge number confirmed. Derek Patterson is an active Deputy United States Marshal in good standing, assigned to the Witness Security Program. Exercise appropriate professional courtesy." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Derek finally lowered his hands, though he made no other sudden movements. Novak stood frozen beside the open passenger door of the vehicle he had illegally searched. Brennan and Webb exchanged another look, this one carrying the weight of everything they had just witnessed and everything they knew would follow. And around them, the neighborhood continued to record, phones capturing the aftermath of a disaster that had been entirely preventable. Derek turned to face Novak directly. His expression was not angry, though he had every right to be furious. It was something worse. It was the look of profound disappointment, the expression of a law enforcement professional seeing everything he had dedicated his life to being betrayed by someone who wore the same kind of badge. "I want your name and badge number," Derek said. "And I want the same from every officer present." Novak hesitated. It was a small hesitation lasting perhaps 2 seconds, but it spoke volumes. Officers are legally required to provide this information upon request. The hesitation showed that Novak understood he was in serious trouble and was looking for some way to avoid accountability. There was no way out. There was only the reckoning that his own actions had made inevitable. Derek pulled out his phone and began documenting the scene with methodical precision. He photographed the officers, the patrol cars, the license plates, the crowd of witnesses, the evidence of the search still visible through the open passenger door. He recorded a brief video statement establishing time, date, location, and the sequence of events. He was building a case, and everyone present knew it, and there was nothing they could do but watch. Brennan provided her name and badge number without hesitation. Webb followed suit. They understood that cooperation now was their only chance of separating themselves from the disaster Novak had created. They had tried to intervene. They had attempted to de-escalate. The recordings would show their efforts to correct course. Perhaps that would be enough to save their careers. Perhaps not. But refusing to cooperate would only make things worse. Novak finally gave his information in a flat, hostile tone. Name, badge number, unit assignment. The bare minimum required by law, offered with the obvious reluctance of someone who knew those details would soon appear in federal complaints and internal affairs investigations. Derek wrote everything down carefully, then took several more photographs for good measure. When he was satisfied that he had documented everything necessary, he finally turned back to the vehicle that had been searched without his consent. "I need to inventory the contents of this vehicle before I leave," he said, addressing Brennan rather than Novak. "As a professional courtesy, I'm letting you know that this car may contain sensitive federal materials. If anything has been disturbed or removed, that will need to be documented." Brennan nodded. "Of course, sir. Take whatever time you need." The inventory took 15 minutes. Derek methodically checked every item in the vehicle, comparing its current state to his memory of how he had left things before the stop. The case files he had reviewed during the site assessment were still present, still sealed, their contents apparently unexamined. His personal effects were scattered but complete. The search had been intrusive but ultimately superficial, more about asserting dominance than conducting any genuine investigation. When he was finished, Derek closed the passenger door and walked around to the driver's side. Before getting in, he stopped and looked at Novak one final time. "You had every opportunity to handle this correctly," Derek said. "Every chance to listen, every moment to check yourself. I told you who I was. I told you where my credentials were. I asked permission to show them to you. All you had to do was let me." Novak said nothing. His jaw was tight. his expression hostile, but he had no response because there was no response that could possibly justify what he had done. Derek got into the sedan, started the engine, and drove away. He maintained a careful speed as he navigated out of the neighborhood, checking his mirrors frequently, half expecting another attempt at a stop. It never came. Behind him, Novak stood in the street surrounded by witnesses, recorded by cameras, watched by fellow officers who understood that they had just witnessed the end of a career. After Derek had departed, Brennan approached Novak with a grim expression. "What the hell was that?" "I made a judgment call. You illegally detained a federal marshal. You searched his vehicle without consent or probable cause. You filed a false report with dispatch, and your body camera was running the entire time." Brennan shook her head in disbelief. "Your judgment call is going to end your career. I just hope it doesn't take the rest of us down with you." Novak said nothing. Perhaps he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had done. Perhaps he was still searching for some way to justify his actions, some rationalization that would let him believe he had been right. Either way, the die was cast. The recordings existed, the witnesses had seen everything, and the federal officer who had been wrongfully detained had 17 years of experience and the full resources of the United States Marshal Service behind him. The videos began appearing online within 2 hours of the incident. Carmen Rodriguez, the neighbor who had first started recording, posted her footage to social media with a detailed account of what she had witnessed. By evening, the video had been viewed over 300,000 times. By midnight, that number had passed 2 million. By the next morning, every major news outlet in the country was covering the story. The footage was damning beyond any reasonable dispute. Carmen's video showed the full context of the interaction, the cooperating driver, the aggressive officer, the unreasonable escalation. When combined with the body camera footage that would later be released, it painted an undeniable picture of misconduct, prejudice, and abuse of authority. Local news was first, with live trucks arriving at the Milwaukee County Police Department headquarters before sunset on the day of the incident. National coverage followed by morning, with the story leading the early news cycles on every major network. A decorated federal marshal illegally detained and searched during what appeared to be a racially motivated traffic stop. The headlines wrote themselves, and they were devastating for everyone involved. The Milwaukee County Police Department issued its first statement late that same evening. It was the kind of generic, non-committal language that departments always deploy in crisis situations. "We are aware of the incident. We take all allegations seriously. An internal investigation has been initiated. We cannot comment on specifics while the investigation is ongoing." The public response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Social media erupted with demands for accountability. Local activists organized a protest outside police headquarters within 48 hours. National civil rights organizations issued statements calling for a federal investigation. The pressure was immense, and it was only beginning. Within 3 days of the incident, the United States Marshal Service released an official statement confirming that Deputy Marshal Derek Patterson had been illegally detained and subjected to an unlawful search during an unjustified traffic stop. The statement announced that a formal complaint had been filed with the Department of Justice and that the Marshal Service would cooperate fully with any resulting investigation. That announcement changed everything. This was no longer a local police matter that could be handled quietly with internal discipline and buried statistics. Federal involvement meant federal scrutiny. It meant the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. It meant the kind of oversight that local departments spent enormous resources trying to avoid. Officer Raymond Novak was placed on administrative leave within 72 hours. The police union initially attempted to defend him with a statement about the difficult split-second decisions officers must make in the field. That defense collapsed almost immediately when the body camera footage was released through a Freedom of Information request. The video showed no difficult decisions. It showed a 9-year pattern of behavior finally being documented in undeniable detail. The footage was studied and dissected by legal experts across the country. Their assessments were unanimous and devastating. From the moment Novak asked what Derek was doing in the neighborhood, he had demonstrated bias. His refusal to allow identification was inexplicable. His false report to dispatch was criminal. His search of the vehicle was unconstitutional. Any single one of these violations could end a police career. All of them together meant that Raymond Novak was finished in law enforcement and quite possibly headed to prison. The internal investigation moved with unprecedented speed, driven by intense public pressure and the looming threat of federal intervention. Investigators reviewed every piece of available footage, interviewed all officers present, canvassed the neighborhood for additional witnesses, and conducted a comprehensive review of Novak's entire employment history. What they found was disturbing, but not surprising to anyone who had been paying attention. Those 14 previous complaints, over 9 years, showed an undeniable pattern. 11 of them involved traffic stops of black drivers. Most occurred in predominantly white neighborhoods. The complaints described remarkably consistent behavior, aggressive approaches, questions about what the person was doing in the area, searches conducted on thin pretexts or no pretexts at all. The department had noticed. That was the most damning part. Supervisors had flagged some incidents for additional training. Novak had been counseled multiple times about his approach to community interactions. There was documentation of concerns, memos expressing hope for improvement, files suggesting that someone understood there was a problem, but nothing ever escalated to real discipline. No suspensions, no demotions, no serious consequences that might have changed his behavior before he targeted someone who could not be silenced or intimidated. 4 weeks after the traffic stop on Birchwood Lane, the Milwaukee County Police Department announced the termination of Officer Raymond Novak. The official statement cited multiple policy violations: illegal detention, unconstitutional search, filing false reports, conduct unbecoming an officer, and failure to follow department protocols for interaction with federal agents. The termination was immediate and permanent, with no possibility of reinstatement or appeal. But termination was only the beginning of Novak's problems. The local district attorney's office announced that it was reviewing the case for potential criminal charges. Violating constitutional rights under color of law is a federal crime. Conducting an illegal search is a state crime. Filing false reports is both. Novak faced the possibility of prosecution at multiple levels, and his union, which had quietly abandoned its defense once the full footage became public, could not protect him from any of it. The Department of Justice expanded its investigation beyond the individual incident. What had started as a complaint about one wrongful stop became a comprehensive pattern and practice review of the entire Milwaukee County Police Department. Federal investigators examined training protocols, complaint procedures, disciplinary processes, and supervisory oversight. They wanted to know how an officer with 14 complaints had been allowed to continue operating without meaningful intervention. They wanted to understand whether Novak was an outlier or a symptom of a broader disease. How many officers are out there right now, operating with the same biases and the same lack of accountability? What do you think needs to change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The investigation revealed systemic failures at every level. Complaint procedures were designed to discourage rather than encourage citizen feedback. Early warning systems existed on paper but were rarely used in practice. Supervisors faced no consequences for ignoring warning signs and officers under their command. The culture of the department had evolved to protect its own rather than police its own, and that failure had allowed Raymond Novak to continue his pattern of abuse until he finally targeted someone with the power to hold him accountable. Derek Patterson gave one interview to a national news program 3 weeks after the incident. He was measured and professional, exactly what you would expect from someone in his position. He did not perform outrage or demand vengeance. He simply explained what had happened and why it mattered. "I didn't want to become the face of this story," he said. "I was just driving back from a work assignment. But when I thought about all the people who experience what I experienced without having a badge of their own, without having cameras from multiple angles, without having the resources to fight back, I knew I had to speak out." He described the fear he felt during the stop, even as a trained law enforcement professional, the uncertainty of not knowing how far the officer would escalate. The sick realization that his 17 years of service, his dedication to protecting the public, his federal credentials, none of it mattered to an officer who had already decided he was a threat based solely on the color of his skin. "If this can happen to me," Derek said, "imagine what happens to people who don't have my training, my platform, my protections. That's why this matters, not because of what happened to me personally, because of what it reveals about a system that allows officers like this to operate for years without consequences. The interview resonated because of its measured tone. Derek was not interested in making himself a victim or a hero. He was interested in reform, better training, meaningful oversight, real consequences for officers who abuse their authority, accountability not just for individuals but for the systems that enable them. Civil rights organizations across the country used the case as a teaching example. Here was a decorated federal agent, a man whose entire career was dedicated to upholding the law, treated like a criminal for no reason other than prejudice. If someone with his level of authority and training could be targeted, then no one was safe from biased policing. The case became a powerful argument for reform precisely because the victim was someone whose credibility could not be easily dismissed. The case also highlighted the critical importance of recording police interactions. Without Carmen Rodriguez's video, without the body camera footage, it would have been Novak's word against Derek's. The officer could have written a report claiming the suspect was uncooperative, resisted identification, exhibited threatening behavior. Those claims would have become the official record, and who would have believed a different story? But the cameras told the truth. They captured every moment of cooperation, every refusal to allow identification, every lie told to dispatch. They made denial impossible and accountability inevitable. For everyone watching, the lesson was clear. Document everything. The phone in your pocket might be the only thing standing between a victim and injustice. 8 months after the traffic stop, federal charges were filed against Raymond Novak. 3 counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, illegal search and seizure, and making false statements to federal investigators. Each count carried potential prison time. Taken together, they represented the complete destruction of a career and a life built on the abuse of authority. The trial took place 16 months after the initial incident. The evidence presented by prosecutors came from multiple sources and told a single, consistent story. Body camera footage showed Novak's bias from the first words he spoke. Carmen Rodriguez's video showed the broader context of unwarranted aggression. Testimony from officers Brennan and Webb established that they had attempted to intervene and been rebuffed. Dispatch recordings captured the false report in Novak's own voice, and Derek's detailed documentation provided a precise timeline that contradicted every defense claim. The defense attempted to argue that Novak had made errors in judgment but had not acted with criminal intent. That argument collapsed when prosecutors presented the pattern of his previous complaints. This was not a single mistake by an otherwise good officer. This was the culmination of 9 years of discriminatory behavior that had been documented, noted, and ignored until it finally became undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Guilty on all 3 counts. Novak stood motionless as the verdict was read, his face betraying no emotion. Behind him, family members wept. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited to capture his exit for the evening news. The man who had spent 9 years as a police officer would now become a convicted felon, and nothing could undo the choices that had brought him to this moment. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge acknowledged Novak's years of public service, but emphasized that his betrayal of the oath he had sworn made his crimes more serious, not less. He had been given authority to protect and serve, and he had used that authority to harass and violate. He had lied to cover his misconduct. He had shown no remorse during the trial. These factors demanded a meaningful sentence: 22 months in federal prison, 4 years of supervised release, a permanent prohibition on working in any law enforcement capacity anywhere in the country for the rest of his life. For someone who had built his entire identity around being a police officer, this sentence represented total destruction. His pension was forfeit. His career was over. His reputation was gone forever. His name would appear in training materials as an example of how bias and unchecked authority can destroy everything. A cautionary tale for every officer who thought their badge placed them above the law. The Milwaukee County Police Department settled a civil lawsuit with Derek for a substantial, undisclosed sum. More importantly, the settlement included binding agreements for continued reform efforts and ongoing federal monitoring of the department, independent civilian oversight of complaint procedures, enhanced early warning systems with mandatory supervisory response, regular review of body camera footage by outside analysts, comprehensive implicit bias training required for every officer on the force. The city's taxpayers would ultimately bear the financial burden of these reforms and the lawsuit settlement. That was the cost of years of failed leadership, of complaints ignored and patterns overlooked, of a culture that protected problem officers rather than removing them. One officer's misconduct, enabled by systemic failures at every level, had resulted in consequences that would reshape the department for decades. 4 supervisors who had reviewed Novak's previous complaints without taking meaningful action also faced discipline. 2 were demoted from supervisory positions. 2 others were required to complete extensive retraining and placed under enhanced oversight. The message was clear: looking the other way would no longer be tolerated. Supervisors who failed to address problem officers would themselves face consequences. Derek returned to his regular duties with the United States Marshal Service. He did not seek ongoing media attention or try to become a professional activist. He had a job to do: protecting witnesses, apprehending fugitives, upholding the law, and he continued doing it with the same dedication that had defined his 17-year career. But his case had an impact far beyond his personal experience. Police departments across the country began using the incident in training programs. It became a case study in what not to do during a traffic stop, a detailed example of how quickly an officer's unchecked bias could transform a routine interaction into a career-ending catastrophe with criminal consequences. Trainers would show the body camera footage, pause at key moments, ask recruits to identify the decision points where everything could have gone differently. The case also influenced policy changes in multiple jurisdictions. Several states passed legislation inspired by what happened on Birchwood Lane: enhanced requirements for tracking and analyzing complaint patterns, mandatory early intervention programs for officers showing warning signs, stricter documentation requirements for traffic stops, including specific notation of the reason for the stop before any other interaction occurred. Some officers complained that reforms like these made their jobs harder, that they would be second-guessed for every decision, that the pendulum had swung too far toward scrutiny. But most professional law enforcement officers understood the real lesson: treat everyone with respect and dignity. Follow constitutional guidelines. Allow people to identify themselves. Do not let assumptions about who belongs where override training and common sense. It was not complicated. It was the basic requirement of the job they had sworn to do. Carmen Rodriguez, the neighbor whose quick thinking had provided crucial evidence, gave several interviews about why she started recording. She said the officer's body language had immediately seemed wrong to her, aggressive and hostile in a way that did not match the situation she was observing. She had lived in that neighborhood for 11 years and had always believed in supporting police. But what she saw that afternoon made her reach for her phone on pure instinct. Something just felt off, she explained. The man at the car was so calm, so cooperative, and the officer was treating him like a dangerous criminal for no reason I could see. I thought maybe I was missing something. I thought the video would show that, but it didn't. It showed exactly what I thought I was seeing. Her actions sparked important conversations about citizen oversight and the role of bystanders during police interactions. Recording police activity is legal in virtually all circumstances, and videos from witnesses often provide crucial evidence that official body cameras might miss or that departments might be reluctant to release. Carmen's willingness to document what she witnessed helped ensure that justice was possible. In a case where the official could have easily lied about what happened, her video made the truth undeniable. If you have made it this far, you understand why these stories matter. They expose the systems that fail, they honor the people who fight back, and they create pressure for the changes that have to happen. Subscribe if you want to see more stories like this one. Share if you think others need to hear it. And remember that accountability only happens when enough people demand it. The story of that traffic stop on a Thursday afternoon in Belmont Heights became more than just one incident between one biased cop and one federal agent. It became evidence of a systemic problem and a roadmap for how to address it. Document everything possible, demand accountability consistently, support meaningful reform efforts. Never accept that this is just how things have to be. Raymond Novak destroyed his own career the moment he decided to pull over someone based on assumptions rather than evidence. Every decision he made after that just made things worse. He had multiple opportunities to correct course, to listen, to allow identification, to admit error. He chose aggression and denial instead, and the cameras captured every moment. Derek Patterson never asked to become a symbol. He was simply driving home from work when he was stopped for no legitimate reason. But his experience became a teaching moment for the entire country about what policing should look like and what it absolutely should not tolerate. 17 years of dedicated service. A career spent protecting the public, and he still was not safe from being profiled and mistreated by a biased officer. That reality is uncomfortable for many people to accept. It challenges assumptions about fairness and justice that we want to believe are true, but accepting uncomfortable realities is the first step toward changing them. In the end, justice was served. Novak went to prison, Derek received compensation, and more importantly, validation. The department was forced to implement real reforms. Supervisors faced consequences for their failures. The system for once worked the way it was supposed to work, but the whole situation should never have been necessary in the first place. If Novak's earlier complaints had been taken seriously, if supervisors had intervened when the pattern became clear, if the culture of the department had prioritized accountability over protection, if any of those things had happened differently, that traffic stop on Birchwood Lane would never have occurred. That is the deeper lesson of this story. Accountability cannot wait until catastrophe forces it. The warning signs are almost always there. The complaints, the patterns, the officers whose behavior suggests problems are developing. Systems that ignore those warnings eventually produce the exact disasters they should have prevented. And when they do, the consequences fall not just on the individual officers involved, but on entire communities, on public trust, on the vast majority of law enforcement professionals who do their jobs with integrity and see their reputations damaged by the misconduct of colleagues who should have been stopped years earlier. What would you have done if you were one of the neighbors watching that stop unfold? Would you have started recording? Would you have intervened? What do you think needs to change to prevent incidents like this from happening again? The cameras were watching on Birchwood Lane. The truth was documented. Justice eventually was served. But somewhere right now, in some neighborhood across this country, another traffic stop is happening. Another officer is letting bias override training. Another person is being treated like a suspect for the crime of existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. And the only questions that matter are whether anyone is recording and whether anyone in power will care enough to act when the footage proves what happened. Those questions will determine whether this story becomes a turning point or just another incident in an endless cycle. The answer depends on all of us, on our willingness to document, our refusal to look away, our insistence that accountability is not optional. That is how change happens. One recorded video at a time, one refused excuse at a time, one demanded consequence at a time, until the exceptions become the rule and justice becomes the expectation rather than the surprise.